In the long shadow of the Civil War, the South was a land cracked open by memory. The year was 1868, and though the cannons had fallen silent, their echoes still lingered in the soil, in the cotton fields that stretched white as bone across the Mississippi Delta. The air was thick, heavy, as though the very land demanded repentance, but repentance never came. What did come was scandal, one so devastating that it would unravel a dynasty, expose hypocrisy, and ignite whispers that still cling to the ruins today. At the heart of it all was Eleanor Whitfield, the porcelain daughter of a Confederate colonel, raised among chandeliers and silence, and Jonathan Reed, a man born in bondage, who carried in his voice the weight of survival and the quiet defiance of freedom. Their love, forbidden and fearless, was no ordinary trespass. It was a rebellion against a world built on chains, a spark that threatened to consume an entire bloodline. This is the story of how a single forbidden glance grew into an inferno, how a child born of defiance became a message the South could not silence, and how a name once feared rotted into ash. It is not just a tale of love and scandal, it is the anatomy of a society's deepest lie, cracked wide open by truth. Before we step inside the Whitfield estate and walk the cotton fields heavy with memory, tell us, where are you watching from? And what time is it where you are? The Mississippi Delta in 1868 was a place where time itself seemed trapped. The war was over, but the soil had not forgotten. Cotton sprouted in endless rows like a white sea, but beneath its softness lay the bones of generations who had bent their backs to harvest it. And at the heart of these acres stood the Whitfield estate, a monument not to grace but to arrogance, its great white columns holding not only a roof but the secrets of a dying empire. Inside that house lived Eleanor Whitfield, the only child of Colonel Silas Whitfield. To outsiders, she was everything a Southern belle should be: graceful, obedient, fragile as porcelain. She had been taught to smile at dinner guests, to lower her eyes at compliments, to let her fingers glide across piano keys like whispers. But what no lesson had prepared her for was restlessness. That restlessness burned in her chest like a hidden ember. She read too many books, asked too many questions, and walked too often along the edges of the estate, where silence lingered heavier than perfume. Her father carried the war in his posture, in the way he paced the veranda like a general still awaiting orders. The gray uniform he once wore was gone, but his pride remained stitched into his bones. He no longer spoke of the Confederacy, not because he had lost, but because he despised a world that dared to move forward without him. For him, the estate was a fortress. For Eleanor, it was a cage. The workers in the fields were free by law, yet freedom here was a cruel joke. They still bent under the weight of cotton, still bowed their heads when addressed, still lived under the watchful eye of white men who believed their authority eternal. All except one, Jonathan Reed. Jonathan was unlike the others. Though once enslaved, he walked with a dignity that no whip had ever broken. His body bore scars, yes, but his eyes carried something deeper: memory and defiance. He did not shuffle when spoken to, nor avert his gaze when a white face met his own. To many in the fields, he was both a threat and a beacon, a man whose survival itself was rebellion. Some whispered he could read. Others said he could recite lines of scripture or poetry, as if the words had been carved into him by fire. Whatever the truth, he carried himself as if the chains had long since fallen from his soul. It was inevitable that Eleanor noticed him. Perhaps it began in passing her on horseback, him in the fields, a pause in her ride, a lingering glance across rows of cotton. At first, nothing more than silence passed between them. But in the South, even silence could be dangerous. When carried between a white woman and a black man, the first true act of daring came in the form of a book. Eleanor, restless in her father's house, rummaged through the attic and unearthed an old volume of poetry, yellowed with age. One morning, she carried it to the well under the sycamore tree and left it there, a quiet offering where she knew Jonathan often passed. For days it remained untouched, and she almost abandoned the foolish gesture. But then, it returned. Tucked inside was a mark beside a single line written in bold ink. Love does not ask permission from history. Those words burned through her like fire. She read them again and again, tracing the letters with trembling fingers. When next their paths crossed by the stables, she nodded. Only slightly, but enough for the air between them to shift. In the Delta, such a nod could build gallows. Her father noticed her silence at supper. One evening, bourbon glass in hand, Colonel Whitfield studied her with suspicion. "You're quieter these days," he said. Eleanor folded her hands neatly. "There isn't much to say." He narrowed his eyes. "Then find something proper to occupy your thoughts. The Wentworth son has returned from Charleston." His words dripped with intent. Marriage was a transaction, and she was the currency. She smiled faintly, but her smile was a blade still sheathed. "I'm sure he has," she answered. Outside, beyond the glow of gas lamps, Jonathan stood near the stables, his hands calloused from labor. He knew the danger of looking too long, of wanting too much. In the South, a black man's life could be stolen in a heartbeat for less than a glance. Yet he also knew he had already survived what was meant to kill him: chains, hunger, war. He had no reason left to fear desire. What began with words soon became ritual. A book left at the well, a note scrawled in charcoal across a page. "How do you cage something that was born to run?" Her reply. "You don't. You run with it. Or you let it break your hands trying." Their exchanges were never spoken aloud, but they spoke volumes. They carved out a secret language where silence was holy, where memory and longing met. Eventually, secrecy could not contain them. Their first meeting was framed as an accident in the old barn behind the west field. A place abandonnée, half-rotted. The boards cracked enough for moonlight to slip through. Eleanor came with her sketchbook. Jonathan came with his thoughts. They sat back to back at first, reading from the book she had left him. Her voice wavered but grew steady. He listened with closed eyes, as if the words belonged to her mouth alone. "Were you ever taught to read?" she asked one night, curiosity trembling in her voice. He laughed bitterly. "Taught, no. But I learned. My mother carved letters into tree bark, into dirt, into me before they sold her away." His words fell heavy, filling the space between them. She didn't answer. Instead, she slid the poetry book closer. "Then read with me." The barn became their sanctuary. Within its shadows, they shared stories that could not be told elsewhere. He spoke of the whipping tree, whose bark still reeked of blood. She spoke of her mother's death and her father's silence. In their confessions, they found an understanding no sermon could teach. Pain was loudest when buried, and in each other. They unearthed it. By day, Eleanor was the colonel's daughter, trained in propriety and silence. By night, she was barefoot, whispering verses in a barn lit only by a lantern. And Jonathan, once chained to the will of others, now sat beside her, listening to the sound of his own name spoken with tenderness. But the South is a land of eyes and ears. Shadows lengthened at the edges of their secret. And as their moments grew bolder, the storm that had always lingered over the Whitfield estate began to gather in earnest. The weeks that followed turned silence into ritual. Every glance between Eleanor and Jonathan became a thread, weaving a tapestry that neither dared to name. Yet both felt growing heavier with each passing day. The barn behind the west field, once a place of cobwebs and forgotten tools, transformed into their hidden chapel. Its cracked beams and gaps of moonlight became witness to a love both impossible and undeniable. At first, their meetings were small, sharing passages from poems, exchanging thoughts like fugitives of the heart. Eleanor's voice trembled as she read aloud verses about freedom, love, and rebellion. But Jonathan's presence steadied her. His responses were few but deep, words spoken with the gravity of a man who knew the cost of truth. "You sound like the words were written for you," he told her once, his tone soft but unshakable. "And you?" she answered. "Speak like a man who shouldn't have survived here at all." Their laughter, rare as it was, filled the hollow barn with echoes of a world that might have been one where chains had never been forged. And names like Whitfield or Reed were not walls but doors. But even in this fragile sanctuary, shadows crept. One night, Eleanor asked in a whisper, what would happen if they knew? Jonathan looked at her long, his eyes reflecting the lantern's dim flame. They wouldn't call it love. They'd call it war. The storm came sooner than they expected. A summer thunder rolled across the delta, tearing at the sky like a wounded beast. Eleanor almost stayed in her room that night. But her heart, wild, restless, pulled her to the barn. She arrived drenched, hair clinging to her face, her chest heaving with both fear and exhilaration. Jonathan lit a lantern, its glow painting her in gold. "You shouldn't have come," he said, his voice low, taut with warning. "I couldn't stay," she replied. The silence after was not empty. It was heavy with everything they had not yet admitted. She stepped closer, trembling. Not from fear, but from recognition. Recognition that the line had already been crossed. Their lips met, tentative at first, then fierce, as though centuries of silence demanded repayment in a single breath. It was not lust that bound them in that moment. But defiance, a confession wrapped in fire. When Eleanor returned to the house, the storm had passed, but inside her a new one began to rage. She sat before her mirror, staring into her own eyes, as if daring them to deny what had happened. They did not. The nights that followed blurred into a rhythm of reckless devotion. No longer did she creep barefoot as if hiding from ghosts. She walked openly beneath the moonlight, as though daring the heavens themselves to condemn her. Jonathan, too, no longer tempered his questions. He asked her things no one else would dare. "Do you believe your father ever loved anything that couldn't be owned?" he asked one night, his voice laced with bitterness. "Would you still love me if I returned to my father's world?" To silk gowns and supper parties, she countered. Neither question had a true answer. But both of them understood that love was not safety, it was risk. A risk they both had already taken. Then came the night when silence gave way to fire. Fireflies circled the barn like tiny, glowing witnesses, and the summer heat pressed down heavy, thick with the scent of earth and sweat. Eleanor entered barefoot again, but not as a restless girl chasing mystery. She came with purpose, her eyes fierce, and her body alive with decision. Jonathan was already there, reading by lamplight. When their eyes met, something shifted in the air. "I'm not afraid," she whispered. "You should be," he answered, though his hands trembled as he set aside the book. "But I am." She stepped forward, placing her hand over his chest. "Not of you." What followed was not sudden, it was centuries breaking. His hand traced her jaw. Her lips parted. And when they came together, it was not desperation but recognition. They were not simply bodies in rebellion, they were history rewritten in flesh. For once, a black man chose rather than was forced, and a white woman claimed her body for love rather than for purity. The barn walls seemed to breathe with them, the floor groaning like it bore witness to a miracle, long denied. Afterward, they lay in silence. Eleanor rested her head on his chest, his fingers tracing lines down her back like unwritten verses. "Do you believe in fate?" she asked, her voice breaking the quiet. "I believe in consequences," he said, steady as stone. She smiled faintly. "I think we just started both." But outside, beyond the stables, a shadow shifted. A figure turned away, silent as a sin, quick as vengeance. Someone had seen. And the Delta, though it buried secrets deep, always had a way of spitting them back out when it chose. From that night onward, their sanctuary was no longer safe. Each step Eleanor took back to the house was weighed with suspicion. Each glance Jonathan cast across the fields felt heavier, as though invisible eyes clung to him. Yet neither stopped. If anything, their meetings grew more desperate, as if time itself was against them, as if every hour stolen together was a victory. There are touches that soothe, touches that wound, and touches that change bloodlines forever. Theirs was the third kind, and in the silence of their love, the Old South began to tremble. The first sign was not guilt or fear, but nausea. One morning, as the sun bled across the cotton fields, Eleanor felt her stomach twist in a way she could not explain. At first, she dismissed it as heat, or nerves, or perhaps even punishment from God for the secret she carried each night. But by the second cycle of mist rising from the delta fields, she knew. The mirror in her chamber betrayed what her lips would not say, her face still porcelain, her gowns still elegant. But her eyes, those no longer searched. They decided, beneath silk and lace, a new life had begun. She pressed her palm gently over her belly and whispered into the quiet, "He's still with me." No tears came, because tears belong to regret, and she felt none. Not for Jonathan, not for the nights in the barn, not for the storm that had made her body a temple of defiance. When she told Jonathan, she did not hide behind veils or caution. She crossed the fields in daylight, her figure visible to all who dared to watch. Time seemed to hold its breath as she walked. When she reached him, dirt still clinging to his hands, her voice carried both thunder and terror. "I am carrying your child." Jonathan froze. The weight of her words struck him harder than any whip. His breath vanished, his eyes wide, his calloused hand reaching for hers. "Are you sure I know my own body?" she said, her voice like steel beneath silk. "And I know what we made." He turned toward the horizon, where endless cotton blurred with sky, and whispered, "Then we cannot stay here." That night, in the barn that had sheltered both love and fire, they spoke of escape. Jonathan mentioned Memphis, of groups who aided freedmen and those hunted by the South's bitter silence. "They could hide us, protect us. We could disappear." But Eleanor cut him off. "My father will never let me go. He will hunt you. He already does, even if he doesn't yet know why." Jonathan stepped closer, his voice rough but unwavering. "If we stay, we lose everything. If we run, maybe we keep us." Their eyes met, and in that glance they both saw the truth. There was no path untouched by blood. For a while, she managed to hide the swelling beneath corsets pulled tighter, gowns chosen carefully, but houses like Whitfield's were filled with eyes-maids who whispered, cousins who speculated, aunts who traded suspicions like currency, and eventually, her father noticed. It happened at supper. Colonel Silas Whitfield paused mid-bite, his eyes lingering too long on her face. "You look flushed," he said. Unwell Eleanor's fork trembled against her plate. "Perhaps the change in weather," she replied lightly. He did not blink. "Or perhaps something else grows inside you." Her breath caught, but she forced a smile. He did not press further. He didn't need to. That night, she overheard him speaking in low tones with Reverend Morgan on the veranda. "Watch her. Something's wrong." The storm broke quickly. Whispers spread. Suspicions sharpened. And one careless word from a kitchen maid gave the secret a name: Jonathan. The colonel did not rage, did not shout. He simply sat on the porch, staring into the dark, and muttered, "I should have put him down years ago." At dawn, Jonathan was summoned. 2 overseers came, not with chains but with smirks, more dangerous than rope. "The colonel wants a word." Jonathan wiped his hands on a rag, and his spine straight as a rifle, and followed. They did not lead him to the barn or the fields, but to the front steps of the house. There stood Silas Whitfield, hatred carved into his face like scripture into stone. Beside him, Eleanor was held back by her aunt's tight grip, her face pale but unyielding. "You've taken what ain't yours." The colonel snarled, "Defiled this house. Shamed my blood." His voice cracked the silence like a whip. "Answer me. Boy, did you lie with her?" Jonathan's chest rose. He stepped forward, not as a slave, not as property, but as a man. Not as a slave, as a man. The gasp that followed seemed to shake the entire veranda. Eleanor's aunt crossed herself. A cousin spat on the ground, and in the colonel's face, fury twisted into something almost feral. His fist struck Jonathan before anyone could move. Blood spilled onto the steps, but Jonathan laughed low. Bitter. Defiant. "You still think your name means something," he rasped. "You still think she belongs to you." That laugh sealed his fate. The colonel's eyes blackened with wrath. "Strip him," he ordered. They dragged Jonathan to the old whipping tree, its bark already marked with scars of generations. The same tree where his mother once bled. The same tree the ivy tried to swallow but could never erase. They tied him there, shirt torn away, back bared to history. Eleanor screamed, her voice tearing through the night. But the colonel did not turn. He raised the whip, and with each strike, 1, 2, 3, the delta remembered. Jonathan did not cry out. He met Eleanor's gaze. His eyes fierce through the blur of blood, and he smiled, not with joy, but with unbreakable defiance. When it ended, Jonathan collapsed, breath ragged, skin torn. "Lock him in the shed," the colonel commanded. "No food, no water. Let the rats teach him humility." Then he turned to Eleanor, his voice cold as steel. "Whatever grows in your belly dies tomorrow." That night, Eleanor sat by her window, her fists clenched around the blood-stained poetry book. She did not weep. Every unshed tear hardened into iron within her chest. Her father thought this was the end, but he was wrong. This was no longer about love. This was war. The shed behind the Whitfield stables was meant for broken tools, not men. Yet Jonathan hung there, wrists bound, wounds rough, his body trembling but unyielding. The night was thick with rot, the buzzing of flies, and the scratching of rats. Sweat dripped into his cuts, and still he kept silent. He remembered his mother's voice through iron bars. "They can chain your hands, baby, but not your mind." He repeated it to himself like prayer. In the main house, Eleanor sat in her darkened room, hair undone, gown slipping from her shoulders, her belly now swelled enough to betray her secret. Aunt Margaret begged, "Say it was a mistake. Say he forced you. The colonel might show mercy." Eleanor laughed, sharp and bitter. "Mercy died when Mama did." The older woman recoiled, making the sign of the cross. "You'll be the death of this family." Eleanor whispered back, "No. Father will." That night, she stole a rusted key from the groundskeeper's belt and soaked a cloth in rosewater. Midnight cloaked the estate in silence. Even the dogs did not bark. She slipped across the yard barefoot, her nightgown glowing ghost-like under the moon. The shed door groaned as she turned the key. Inside, Jonathan sagged, his back carved by cruelty, his lips cracked, his eyes burning still. "Eleanor," he rasped. She ran to him, untying the ropes, her tears finally spilling as she caught his collapsing weight. She pressed the cloth to his wounds, humming broken lullabies her mother once sang. He rested his head in her lap, surrendering not to defeat but to her touch. "We cannot stay," he whispered. "I know," she answered. Her voice shook, not from fear but from resolve. By dawn, the colonel discovered the shed empty. The chains swayed like mocking pendulums. His roar split the morning, glass shattering in his hand. The estate shifted under his rage, servants tense, horses restless, air tasting of iron. His daughter and the man he despised were gone, but Eleanor had not fled far. She led Jonathan to the old smokehouse on the farthest edge of the property, hidden beneath moss and thyme. There, she tended him for days, bringing water, bread, salves stolen from the pantry, His wounds scabbed, though his body remained raw with pain. Her belly swelled heavier with each sunrise. She was no longer the colonel's daughter. She was a woman on the edge of war. One evening, Jonathan sat upright. His eyes hardened. "I want to see him," he said. Eleanor froze. "My father will kill you." "No," Jonathan answered, "is already dead. He just doesn't know it yet. Our son will not inherit silence. He will know his father stood." The plan was madness. But madness was the only path left. At dawn, Jonathan walked the path to the great house openly. No cloak, no disguise. Only his battered body, blood still crusting his shirt. Field hands froze at their tasks. Overseers whispered, but no one moved. He reached the steps of the veranda and knocked 3 times. Colonel Silas opened the door himself. And for the first time in his life, he stepped back. Jonathan's voice was calm, steady, carved in defiance. "This is not your world anymore." Behind him, Eleanor appeared, her hair braided, her red dress fierce against the pale columns, her belly round and undeniable. She took Jonathan's hand and faced her father. "This child carries no shame, only truth. And truth does not bow." Silas's face cracked, rage twisting with disbelief. He raised his hand as if to strike her. But Jonathan stepped forward, his eyes steady as stone. "Touch her, and I swear before every ancestor watching you'll rot before the grave takes you." The colonel's hand trembled, then fell, not in mercy, but in defeat. For the first time, his power meant nothing. Together, Eleanor and Jonathan walked down the veranda steps. No one stopped them. The workers bowed their heads, some with sorrow, some with pride. Overseers kept their silence. Even the wind seemed to shift, carrying with it something the South had long denied: dignity. That night, the estate lay in silence, not from peace but from shame. In the woods, Eleanor and Jonathan lay beside a small fire. He traced her belly, whispering, "He will know we fought," she answered softly, "and he will carry what we could not bury." But the Delta was not done with them. The South never forgave defiance, never forgot humiliation. And while Eleanor and Jonathan had declared themselves free, the world they walked into was sharpening its knives. The cabin outside Vicksburg was nothing more than 4 walls of patched wood, a roof sealed with tar and prayer, and a dirt floor that turned to mud when it rained. Yet to Eleanor and Jonathan, it was a kingdom carved out of defiance. It was here, beneath the whispers of the trees and the watch of freed neighbors, that Eleanor labored through the long night. Inside, women moved like shadows of memory, former midwives, mothers who had birthed children in fields, under gunfire, and in secret, they circled Eleanor as though she were sacred ground. Jonathan held her hand, his jaw clenched, his knuckles white. The air was thick with sweat, incense, and prayer. When the child came, the world held its breath. At first, silence, then a cry loud, piercing, defiant, as if centuries had chosen this child to scream for them. Tears streamed down Eleanor's face, and Jonathan fell to his knees. They named him Malachi, meaning messenger, because he was not just a son, he was proof that love had outlived chains. That memory could not be erased, but joy was a fragile thing in the Delta. Word of Malachi's birth spread quickly, like fire through dry fields. A local paper dared to print it. Eleanor Whitfield, daughter of Colonel Silas Whitfield, gives birth to child by former slave. The headline struck the South like a match against tinder. Some spat in disgust. Others, quietly, offered prayers of protection. Black families brought food, blankets, and candles to the couple. A northern abolitionist society sent letters: "We will fund your protection. Come north." But Eleanor refused. "He was born here. He will grow here." Jonathan agreed. though he kept a pistol by the bed each night. Their love was no longer just theirs. It had become a banner. The colonel, humiliated and enraged, reached for the last weapon of the South, shame. He summoned cousins, preachers, and loyalists, planning to strip Eleanor's name bare in public. Yet before he could act, Jonathan struck first not with fists, but with words. He filed suit in a freedmen's bureau court, accusing the Whitfield estate of years of unpaid labor, unlawful captivity, and blood debts stretching back generations. At first, the courtroom laughed. The notion that a black man could demand payment for chains seemed absurd to the Southern elite. But then came the records, ledgers Eleanor had smuggled out, testimony from workers, letters implicating the colonel in Confederate dealings. What began as scandal grew into a trial, and what grew into a trial became history. Jonathan stood tall before the judge. I don't want his land. I don't want his blood. I want the South to say aloud what it did. Eleanor followed, dressed in black, her voice steady. I do not speak against my father out of hate. I speak because I will not raise my son in a house built on lies. The judgment was not all they hoped. The money awarded was a fraction of what was owed. But the words mattered more than gold. The judge, a former Union officer, wrote, "This court recognizes not just labor stolen, but legacy stolen. It acknowledges for the record that whiteness is not inheritance, character is." Those lines were printed and framed in black schools across Mississippi, in whispers and in sermons. People began to repeat them. In the Whitfield estate, silence grew heavier. Servant left. Relatives stopped visiting. Even the preacher abandoned the colonel's porch sermons. Back at their modest cabin, Eleanor and Jonathan watched Malachi grow. By 4, he was reading. By 5, he was writing. At 7, he asked his father. "What does our name mean?" Jonathan answered. "It means we survived." Malachi looked at his mother, who brushed his curls back, and said, "Then I'll build one out of memory." The child was a mirror of their rebellion, his very existence a declaration. At 12, he stood in town halls and spoke of justice. At 14, he climbed the courthouse steps and declared, "I am the son of a slave and the daughter of a master. I choose neither. I am the future they could not kill." Still, danger stalked them. One night, boots thundered against their cabin door. Voices snarled, "Calhoun sent us. Give us the woman and the bastard." Jonathan leveled his pistol, but before he fired, shadows emerged from the trees, neighbors, freedmen, women with rifles, elders with torches. One stepped forward, a preacher named Ezekiel. His voice rang like scripture. "Not tonight. Not this child." The attackers slunk away into the dark. The community kept watch for days. Malachi was no longer just their son. He was their symbol, the child of memory, the messenger of truth. But symbols are dangerous. They are hunted, envied, worshipped, and Eleanor knew that every step forward came with eyes waiting to strike. Still, she held her son close and whispered, "You were not born to hide." History was no longer something they fled from. It was something they carried, and though the South burned with hatred, Eleanor, Jonathan, and Malachi walked through its flames with a dignity no fire could consume. Years turned like pages, and the Whitfield estate withered into ruin. The once proud house, with its towering columns and manicured lawns, now sagged beneath vines and silence. Colonel Silas Whitfield died alone, his legacy reduced to dust and whiskey stains. No preacher came. No mourners gathered, only the echo of a man who mistook chains for power. Eleanor never returned. Instead, she built her life with Jonathan and Malachi on soil, no longer watered with blood. She grew old with dignity, passing in her sleep at 87. Her name etched simply on a stone, Eleanor, not Whitfield. Not anyone's, just Eleanor. Beside her lay Jonathan, whose memory still burned in the stories Malachi carried. When Malachi became a man, he returned to the crumbling estate one last time. In his pocket, he carried the Whitfield family seal, heavy and tarnished, passed down through generations of cruelty. He walked to the old well where his parents first left poems for each other and whispered, "This is for every name you buried that wasn't white." The seal clinked against stone, then vanished into darkness. He turned away, no longer burdened. The ruins behind him were not monuments. They were warnings. And as he walked toward a world still grappling with its own lies, Malachi carried not vengeance but memory, because blood fades, names decay, but memory that is eternal. If you've stayed with us until now, don't forget to subscribe, like, and share this story. Some histories were never erased, they were only hidden, waiting for us to remember.